Monster, the Ed Gein story, the butcher of Plainfield uncovered. In the frozen farmlands of Plainfield, Wisconsin, the fields were buried in snow, and there was a deep hush that hovered over them. Behind the walls of an ancient farmhouse that had been weathered by the elements, one of the most unsettling stories in the history of the United States was taking shape. The small rural hamlet, which was calm and modest, was unaware of this possibility. Ed Gein was a well-mannered recluse who worked odd jobs and stayed to himself, giving the impression to his neighbors that he was a reclusive handyman. On the other hand, hidden beneath that timid facade was an unfathomable darkness that would one day terrify the entire existence. With the revelation of what he had done, not only would the town be haunted for all of eternity, but it would also give birth to some of the most iconic monsters in the history of film and literature. This is the tale of Ed Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield, and the nightmare world that his sick mind created in the shadow of his mother's ghost. His birth took place on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, and Edward Theodore Gein was born there. His youth was filled with misery, as he was raised by a father who was an alcoholic and a mother who was overbearing and religiously militant. She preached that the world was rife with sin and that women in particular were the source of all corruption. Augusta Gein would rule her home with iron piety, proclaiming that the world was filled with sin. She kept her two kids, Henry and Ed, shut off from the rest of the world, preventing them from forming friendships and exposing them to nothing except her stringent and puritanical ideals. As a result of her authority, the Gein boys were raised in a manner that was emotionally distant from society, devoid of affection, and scared of the moral deterioration that their mother had so clearly detailed. When Ed's father passed away in 1940, the delicate equilibrium that had been there in their household started to break down. After another 4 years, his brother Henry was killed in a fire that was suspiciously located close to the family farm. While the authorities claimed that it was an accident, the injuries that were discovered on Henry's body suggested otherwise. The catastrophe left Ed utterly alone with his mother, whose health was fast failing. Ed was left with no other resources. After Augusta passed away in 1945, Ed's life came crashing down around him. The one person who had provided structure to his life, regardless of how harsh it had been, had passed away. He was crushed in a way that he would never be able to recover from after her passing. While he allowed the rest of the house to deteriorate around him, he locked her bedroom and preserved it as a kind of shrine. It was as if the walls of the farmhouse had become a mausoleum for his sorrow and a reflection of his mind that was deteriorating. Ed entirely withdrew from the world in the years that followed his decision to withdraw. He passed his time by reading pulp horror magazines and anatomy books, both of which were packed with graphic accounts of murder and dismemberment as punishment. His nights, on the other hand, were significantly more ominous. He started going to the local cemeteries under the cover of darkness because he was consumed by feelings of loneliness and infatuation. There he exhumed the bodies of women who had been freshly buried. These were women who were reminiscent of his own mother. He made use of their corpses in horrific deeds while he was in a trance-like state and carried them back to his house. He fashioned garments, lampshades, and masks out of human skin that he had harvested. His woman's suit was a hideous garment made of human skin that he wore in an attempt to feel closer to his mother and to become her. He built bowls out of skulls, furniture that was upholstered with flesh, and even created what he termed his woman's suit. Bernice Worden, the proprietor of a local hardware store, disappeared on November 16, 1957, which was the day when Ed's horrific existence were finally brought to light. On the floor, her son, who was a deputy sheriff, found a receipt for a gallon of antifreeze that had been sold to Ed Gein earlier that morning. He also found blood on the floor. The Gein property was visited by law enforcement in order to question him, but the contents of the farm were beyond their comprehension. It was discovered that Bernice's body was hanging upside down in a shed and that it had been gutted like an animal. While inside the house, there were human skulls that were used as bowls, organs that were housed in jars, masks that were formed from faces, and furniture that was constructed from bones and skin. At the time of his arrest, Ed spoke without showing any emotion, as if he were detailing mundane activities rather than heinous crimes. It was determined by psychiatrists that he suffered from schizophrenia as well as severe mental disorder. Instead of being sent to prison, he was transferred to a state mental facility after being declared legally insane. The conviction for the murder of Bernice Worden was handed down in 1968, and he was determined to be competent to stand trial for the crime. However, he was ruled crazy at the time of the crime. The rest of his life was spent confined to the Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he remained a peaceful and pleasant patient until the year 1984, when he passed away as a result of lung cancer. Despite the fact that his crimes were heinous, they left an enduring effect on the culture of the United States. The narrative of Ed Gein managed to make its way into the public awareness, which in turn inspired the creation of some of the most notorious characters in the history of film. The warped mind and gruesome actions of the Butcher of Plainfield served as inspiration for a number of characters in films, including Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. He became the archetype of the modern American monster, a guy whose depravity was not rooted in pure evil, but rather in a tragic collision of isolation, obsession, and pain. Ed Gein became more than just a killer. He became the modern American monster. The narrative was resurrected for a new generation by Netflix in 2025 with the release of Monster, the Ed Gein narrative, The Butcher of Plainfield Uncovered, which was the third part in the critically successful Monster anthology series. The series, which was developed by Ian Brennan and Ryan Murphy, goes deeply into Gein's damaged mind, examining how a lifetime of repression and psychological suffering converted him into one of the most eerie people in the annals of history. Gein is a guy who is sculpted by suffering and consumed by his unwillingness to let go of his mother's ghost, and Charlie Hunnam's portrayal of him conveys both the kindness and the grotesque that he has. Augusta Gein is portrayed by Laurie Metcalf in a manner that is equally captivating. She embodies the intense moral authority and smothering love that created the circumstances for madness. In their responses, critics have expressed a variety of opinions. There are many who praise the show for its portrayal of Gein, which is both humanizing and horrific. They praise the show for having the courage to look at the man behind the myth without praising him. On the other hand, some people believe that it romanticizes tragedy or that it blurs the distinction between narrative and actuality. Nevertheless, regardless of one's point of view, the series has reinvigorated discussions about the real Ed Gein, the characteristics of evil, and the psychological effects of being alone. Uncomfortable concerns are raised, such as whether or not a person can be both a victim and a monster. How much of the feeling of terror originates from within us, and how much of it is created by us when we turn our attention away from the suffering of other people? Ed Gein's narrative continues to be a terrible representation of the frailty of the human condition. His life was not that of a ruthless killer, but rather that of a man whose world collapsed under the pressure of traumatic experiences, repression, and the sense of loss he had experienced. Despite the fact that his actions are inexcusable, his very presence serves as a cautionary tale, a terrifying reminder of what occurs when loneliness grows to a point of insanity and pain turns into insanity. It was not in the shadows but in the silence that the Butcher of Plainfield was born. It was in the voids where love went into control, faith transformed into fear, and loneliness became something horrific. Not only does Monster, the Ed Gein story, detail his horrors, but it also compels us to confront the unsettling reality that monsters are rarely born into the world. In most cases, they are manufactured. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.